The value of items is often misconstrued or misunderstood because people will overvalue it, undervalue it. It's very infrequent to find someone that has a more balanced take on it. Just to clarify from the beginning, major decisions are always going to be more impactful than any individual item purchase is going to make. If you're getting caught in the side lane, it doesn't matter whether you bought the right item or not, you're still going to die if you're outnumbered enough. Same thing if you're just walking into fog of war. With that out of the way, I'm going to go into the differences between core items and non-core items, as well as core runes versus minor runes. Core items, this is what you're going to build pretty much every game. Usually it's the first couple items that you buy, but it can vary depending on the champion. Non-core items is where you've got a little bit more variety on what you want to pick, and it's depending on whatever variables are present in that game. To give you an example, a core item is typically going to be a mythic, although I know that's going to change pretty soon. But for the time being, in Season 13, it's typically a mythic, and then you'll get whatever secondary item your champion likes to have, and then beyond that is where you start changing it up a little bit. Maybe you start putting in Grievous, or you buy armor items for heavy AD, buy magic resist for heavy AP, etc. When it comes to core runes, this is what your champion will typically take and doesn't like to stray from too often, especially keystones. Optional runes are more like second wind versus bone plating, where your champion doesn't have to have one every single game. A lot of times when it comes to runes or items, you will hear the term preference, which I'm generally not a fan of. Preference just means you aren't confident enough to give a proper reason for why one is better than the other. Same thing with saying it feels better. If you are below platinum, do not change anything in your build or runes except whether you build armor or MR. That's it. You want to keep it the exact same, consistent as possible. Do not overthink it. The items and rune changes are not going to matter for your elo because you're making way too many mistakes for it to be relevant. And even if that wasn't the case, how you change your items and runes will affect the decisions that you should make, and you want to keep your decision-making process as consistent as possible. You don't want to add extra complexity when you're already struggling enough. Once you made it to platinum, you can progressively start making small changes if you'd like that you're comfortable with based on the game, as I mentioned before, such as second wind versus bone plating, or legend alacrity versus legend tenacity, that kind of thing. You don't change the whole tree, but just minor things here and there. Now let's talk cooking. When it comes to non-core items or secondary tree, you definitely don't have to do it. It's completely optional. You can go with the standard build, standard runes, and you should have no issues. But if you want to, then that's okay, because it is less impactful to make those changes versus cooking core items and runes, which this is the big deal that a lot of people seem to mess up on. You should not be cooking any core items or keystones, anything like that, until you're a minimum of Diamond Plus. And you ideally don't have better players to copy from, or you're at least able to list out well thought out reasons for why whatever you're choosing would be better for your champion. Ideally fits along what your champion wants to do in a game. Once you have this idea of what you think is better, you need to thoroughly test it and continue to update your ideas on if you think you're right or not. Try your best not to be biased on the results of whatever happened with the change that you made. One of the reasons that I think you should be Diamond Plus is because the changes that you make to your items and runes, or at least the significant changes, are interconnected. Warwick with Lethal Tempo is much better with Stridebreaker than with other items, because the Stridebreaker allows him to stick for long enough to build up the Lethal Tempo. However, Lethal Tempo with Divine Sunderer is really bad on Warwick. Another example can be if you take Aftershock as a rune. Aftershock allows you to be tankier when you engage, so you may not need to build quite as much tankiness as you normally would if you went for another keystone, such as Electrocute, which provides no resistances whatsoever. Of course, it's going to depend on the champion and the variables of the game, but the idea is that it does get a little bit complex, and so if you're not at least Diamond, you don't want to be going into this. Just do whatever the one tricks of your champion do. Not only are items and runes interconnected when it comes to what you want for them, your items and rune changes also affect how you should be playing the game. Some of those make larger changes than others. Example of this is PTA versus Conqueror. Champions that go PTA want to take short trades versus champions that have Conqueror want to go for longer trades because they want to stack up the Conqueror and heal from it, whereas PTA you're usually going for the 3 hits and backing off. Grasp versus Phase Rush on Garen completely changes how he wants to play the game. If I'm taking Grasp, typically I'm trading much more often than I normally would with Phase Rush because I'm stronger with Grasp and allows me to poke more. But in mid to late game, I have to be a lot more careful when split pushing or doing any kind of side lane pressure because I don't have the Phase Rush to get out. So I have to keep that in mind when I'm deciding which lanes to shove, which lanes to slow push, or when to rotate. You always have to keep in mind the pros and cons of whatever decision you do make. If you proceed to play both runes like they're the exact same thing, then you will often heavily regret that. You may not even realize initially what exactly you're doing, but you cannot play different rune choices the exact same. All that being said, how you play around the items and runes that you decide to go with is far more important than the actual choices themselves. Having bone plating is important against champions that have a really hard time proccing it, such as Jax, without fully committing to a trade, but I would rather you have second wind and get the little bit of value that you have from that, versus having bone plating and using it very poorly, not trading based off the cooldown, and in general getting very low value from it. How you play around the rune or item is always the most important part. This also goes for the enemy changing their runes or items. You have to play differently based on what they took. If someone has Hail of Blades, they're going to be a lot scarier than if they take something like Dark Harvest, at least initially. To sum all of this up, if you ever have a game where you felt like you lost because you didn't buy the right item, it's probably not the case. You probably lost because you didn't play correctly based on the items that you did buy. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put any effort into trying to figure out what the best decision is for item and runes, as long as you're not in that below platinum range.